Okay, welcome everybody. It's lovely to see you all this morning. Welcome to the fourth webinar in our Critical Topics in Transport webinar series, hosted by the WCTRS Special Interest Group in Governance and Decision Making. So if you're interested in these topics, we'd love you to be part of the theme and get in touch with us. And if you're interested in maybe presenting a topic as part of this series as well, it'd be great to hear from you. So we're delighted today to have Karolina with us to talk through her presentation, Power Dynamics Affecting How Climate Targets Are Integrated into National Transport Planning. Karolina will talk for approximately half an hour. If you've got any questions, you can either put them in the Q&A function or we can enable your microphones later on so you can ask questions verbally at the end and we can get a conversation going. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Karolina. Thank you, Karolina.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this seminar series, and it's really great to be here. And I hope that everyone can hear me and see the slides I'm sharing. If not, I think you can write also that in the Q&A, but hopefully this will work. Yeah, I work as a senior researcher at VTI, Swedish National Road and Transport Research Institute, and also as an adjunct professor at KTH, the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. And I will give this presentation on power dynamics that affect how climate targets are integrated into national transport planning. And as you will understand, it's ongoing work. So it's really timely for me and my colleagues to also maybe get your questions and feedback to what I will present today. Just to give an overview briefly to the outline of the presentation, I will start with the background to the research project and then say a few words about the context of Swedish national transport planning, and then also another spelling error here, theoretical inspiration and the research design, and then some of the preliminary results, and then hopefully enough time for discussion in the end. Yeah, this is the research project. It's funded by the Swedish Environment Protection Agency. And I want to stress that I'm not doing this alone. I'm doing this together with my three great colleagues, Linnea Eriksson at VTI, and Kristina Lindqvist and Jakob Allansson at Malmö University. And we're in the middle of the work, I could say. So the next step will be to finalize our writings and try to publish what we've been doing. Also still some more analytical work to do, I would say, but the empirical work is completed. The background and motivation to the research project. And yeah, I could say that the overall aim of the research project, I forgot to mention that, but that is really to provide in-depth insights into the practice of national transport planning in Sweden, with a specific focus then on how climate mitigation goals are being integrated in this planning context. And the background to this is maybe quite obvious, but I mean, we have a climate crisis going on, and this crisis urges us to transform the existing transport system. In the Swedish context, I think it might be more or less similar in your countries. In Sweden, the transport system accounts for around 30% of greenhouse gas emissions. And the proportion is higher, around 40%, if also foreign transport, like aviation and shipping, is included. And I mean, those are things we've been aware of for many years, really. So it's nothing new about this. And also many political initiatives and policy initiatives have been taken for quite a long time, like since the early, maybe late 1990s, I could say, focusing on like how to break unsustainable trends. And one of the most recent ones was formulated in 2016. It was a new goal formulation saying that until 2030, the transport sector shall reduce its climate emissions by 70%. and we shall reach 0 emissions by 2045. So that's the formal goal formulation for the transport sector in Sweden at the moment. But unfortunately, progress is still too slow. It's moving in some kind of, positive direction, but really too slow. And I guess that's also quite representative of how the situation is in many countries. And again, this is very, there's nothing I could say. I mean, we all know about that, and it was formulated very clearly by the Swedish Climate Policy Commission in 2019, that with current conditions and decisions, the transport sector will only reach halfway to the goal of reducing emissions by at least 70% by 2030. And they also ask for stronger policy measures and political leadership to move more clearly in the right direction. So that was the background to our research project. There has been many research initiatives in the Swedish context, and also, in other countries too, trying to understand more of why it is so difficult to transform the transport system. And especially we build our research on previous works that has focused on policymaking and planning, and trying to explore this from a critical perspective, trying to conduct quite engaged research focusing on what I now refer to as the mud of policy practice, building on Hayen and Wagner, for instance. I guess our inspiration here is previous works that has conducted quite close analysis, close research, following the practice of policymaking, understanding policymaking as not a linear or rational process. It's very much about how people with different knowledge perspectives, different worldviews, different political understandings meet and interact and collaborate, etc. So that is kind of the fundamental theoretical inspiration for us. And we understand the inertia, the challenges involved here as a power situation also, the power dynamics between different understandings and worldviews. So we found our main theoretical inspiration in that sense in theories on discourse, discursive power, and also governmentality. And maybe I should also say something of why we focus on the national transport arena. Yeah, because in the Swedish research context, at least, there has been quite many studies on local politics and planning for sustainable transport, and also to some extent regional politics and planning. But there is really much more scarce. The knowledge is not so profound about the national transport policy arena. So that was why we wanted to focus on that in this research project. Yeah, back to the theory then. When it comes to discourse, that is an important concept for us, even though I won't come back to it so much maybe, but it's like the fundamental idea we have that, reality is very much shaped by the way we, the meaning making that we as human beings are constantly engaged in and involved in. And there the phrase discourse, I guess it's familiar to most of you. So you can see this as a type of repetition maybe, but so discourse, that refers to a specific ensemble of ideas, concepts and categorizations through which meaning is given to physical and social realities. And the discourse concept has been very influential for the type of policy analysis and planning research that we are trying to do. And in that type of research, discourse is also very closely related to power, because it is exactly this, the meaning making and the way we create worldviews and understandings through discourse, that is also how the conditions for policymaking and planning are created. So discursive power then is something that is always exercised when people meet and interact. And it is about exactly this production of meanings, worldviews, the conceptions of reality and the way things are. And that then determines which opinions and decisions and actions that remain reasonable or like appear reasonable, credible and legitimate. So that's a type of theoretical understanding that has been influential for us in designing the research project and also when carrying out the research. Another concept that we have been inspired by is the concept of governmentality. And as I think of it and have understood it, it's more like, you know, the continuation of discourse theory, because of course the creation of worldviews, meanings, understandings also have like a more practical side. The way we think about the world also gets established in organizational settings, in the institutional context where we work. And from a policy perspective, that is a very important aspect, I think. So governmentality then is about how thought operates within our organized ways of doing things, our regimes of practices, and with its ambitions and effects. Yeah, looking at my notes here, just thinking if I missed to say something. Yeah, I hope it's clear enough. You can ask questions if not. Yeah, based upon that, then the context, the urgency about climate change, the idea of policy making as a non-linear process, an activity where people interact, where worldviews meet, etc., which is also essentially about power then. The aim of this study, which I will now move on and present more about, is to deepen the insights on power dynamics affecting how climate goals are integrated in national transport planning practice, with a specific focus on, first of all, how climate goals are being framed in governmental instructions. Secondly, how the task of transport planning is being defined and delimited in planning documents, and also what norms, routines, and techniques that reproduce or produce power in the organized practice of planning. I'll come back to these focus areas in a while. But first of all, I think I also need to say something about the context of transport planning in Sweden. And this has been actually quite challenging for me in my preparations for the seminar, because I mean, there are many things to say really, but I think often when I meet people from other countries, there is an impression that Sweden is, you know, so progressive in terms of environmental politics and climate mitigation and so on. And I mean, there is really many reasons for thinking that. And I think, yeah, I want to give credit to all the persons who have, you know, worked for those issues in the Swedish context. We have many policy goals established and frameworks and everything. And one of the examples here is the overall Swedish transport policy objective that was decided in 2008, which is to ensure an economically effective and long-term sustainable supply of transportation for citizens and industry across the country. So in that sense, I mean, things have been clarified for quite many years now that long-term sustainable development is really a target for the transport sector. But there are also, of course, tensions within this policy goal between the goal of economic efficiency, economic growth is part of that, of course, but and on the other hand, the sustainability ambitions. This transport policy goal or transport policy objective is also divided into two other main goals, where we have the functional objective for accessibility, which is briefly presented then to provide everyone with basic good quality, accessibility and usability. And here we also have a goal of gender equality and so on. And then the other main goal is a strategic objective for safety, environment and health. So here we have the long-term environmental quality goals and the climate targets and so on. So that is like a very wide contextual description of how this policy area is shaped in the broader perspective. But the focus in our research project here is not on the goal formulations as such, but more the practice of long-term infrastructure planning. So here's the next challenging slide for me. We think this is a very important strategic process to understand more about in the Swedish context, because in Sweden there is a long-term strategic process for how to plan the infrastructure for so every fourth year there is a round of long-term infrastructure planning, and the time horizon for every round of planning is 10, 12, sometimes 15 years. So this is a very strategic process where many things are being decided about, in essence, it's about infrastructure objects. But of course, this is also a very strategic process for the long-term direction of the Swedish transport system as a whole. And one thing that is important to note is, I think, is that in the Swedish administration, the political administration, we have a quite clear division between the government and the ministries on the one hand, and the public authorities, the public administrations on the other hand. I know that in many other countries, you have maybe large ministries that are supposed to implement the political decisions taken by the government. But in Sweden, we have more of an arm's length relation between the political power and the actual implementation. And this means that the Swedish Transport Administration is a very important actor in the Swedish transport planning system, because it is really, I also should say that, so their task is to follow the instructions from the government, but also make their own, semi-independent interpretation of how to best implement that the political decisions and the political instructions. So it's a very important interplay between the government and the transport administration in this case. And the long-term transport planning process is conducted in several steps, starting with the Swedish government formulating a directive for a new orientation plan, which is a very strategic planning document with a long time horizon, 30, 40 years, whether then the transport administration points out possible scenarios and ways forward to meet the targets formulated by the government and established in the parliament too. And then that feeds back to the government, who prepare a government bill on transport infrastructure investments, which then is followed by a new directive to the Swedish Transport Administration to prepare an action plan with a 12-year horizon, often can be a little bit less, a little bit more. And that then is followed by a decision again from the government to establish the action plan or maybe make some adjustments, and then follows an operation planning process and implementation. So this is the focus of our research, and especially we are focused on the initial parts of this process. And I should also say it's the last round that was conducted in 2015 to 2018. And we will focus on the initial parts of that process, and especially then what happened around the climate targets in this interaction between the government and the Swedish Transport Administration. The empirical material is, of course, documents like planning documents, political documents, government instructions, the transport bill, etc. We also conducted qualitative interviews with individuals working at the transport administration, working at the ministry. So far, only one politician, but a few public officials who've been working very close to political decision makers and so on. And also we've been doing some workshops and having more interactive discussions with people who have a long experience of working in this context. Yeah. To the results then, and still preliminary ongoing work. First of all then, the first focus area was about the framing of climate goals in the government instructions, like how are the climate goals being framed, made sense of in that material. And here we notice, when we read the government instructions, that there are many statements about the importance for national transport planning to really consider and engage with sustainability and climate goals. So the government's instructions from 2015 stress many times the importance to consider the long-term environmental quality goals, and then they point specifically at that time still ongoing work to prepare a new climate policy framework, which then led to the target of 70% reduction until 2030. So they state, for instance, that the transport sector's climate emissions are significant and one of the major challenges in achieving the vision for 2050. It's very clear in this material that there is a need for all sectors to reduce their emissions, but there are also statements that really express that the transport sector has a clear responsibility. In these documents, and especially the government bill from 2016, they point specifically also at the national ambition for Sweden to become a global role model and one of the first fossil-free welfare nations in the world. So quite, brave ambitions here, and really pointing at stressing the importance of the transport sector to integrate these targets and so on. Then, when doing discourse analysis or thinking about this as a discourse, you should also pay attention to things that are maybe not being stated and not being said. And here I think it's quite interesting to think of that even though there are many, brave ambitions stated here, it's interesting to see that there is really not much, or in practice almost nothing, being said about potential difficulties, goal conflicts, or the deep challenges involved in reaching those goals. There are no developed arguments or passages in those documents indicating that the work to reach the climate goals might prove to be fundamentally difficult. So it's more focused on the possibilities of working more with renewable energy, better vehicles, a belief in innovation and so on. So a quite strong sense of technological optimism here, and really no developed reasoning about the need for maybe a more fundamental transformation of the transport system. So a clear focus on the importance of the targets, but really not so much about, possible difficulties or conflicts involved. If we go to the next focus area, which is about how the Transport Planning Authority, the Transport Administration, is itself framing their task. Then we go into a matter of more the limitations of the task. And if you remember the picture with the arrows, now we're in the state where the Transport Planning Authority is working with an orientation plan, preparing the long-term strategies, and communicating that back to the government and to the broader society, of course. And in those documents, I think it's interesting to find many statements, again, regarding the need for a more climate-friendly transport system. Then, of course, since these documents are planning documents, they are expected to be more focused on specific measures and so on, and they are so as well. What I think is interesting here is that when those documents, come into more of the reasoning about what measures to take and so on, there's also a recurring and quite significant focus on the limitations of transport infrastructure planning to work with climate targets. So for instance, this quotation from the orientation plan document from 2015 saying that it's difficult to identify infrastructure measures that have significant effects on greenhouse gas emissions. Large infrastructure investments doesn't solve the climate problem. And I think, yeah, I can understand, I guess that's true. You can't solve things with only infrastructure planning, but it also creates a sense throughout the material that infrastructure planning is maybe not so important after all. And this has also been explored in other studies. For instance, Pettersson and others in a recent publication, and Witzell in another recent publication. So this is something that is quite much under discussion now in critical transport policy research in Sweden, this kind of delimitation of the responsibility of long-term transport planning in relation to climate goals. Again, in those documents, an increased emphasis on technological developments, technical innovation, pointing at the importance of new fuels, electrification, and so on. And not so much about, maybe the responsibility, which one could think of really, of planning for a more transport efficient society. That is more discussed today, I would say, but this is in the planning process we focus on here, we can see those elements also of like maybe mentioning that a more transport efficient society is also important, but the main focus is still on technical innovation and new fuels and electrification and so on. And also I think it's important to notice that there are many reminders throughout these documents that the transport system consists of many other actors that also need to do their part. So we get a sense here that it's very much about defining and also delimiting the specific task and responsibility for the transport administration. The third example, and I'm looking at time here. Do I have still 5 minutes, Louise? I hope so. You may stop me if not. Here I will try to give you an example of the part of our work where we try to go in more into norms, routines, and techniques in the organized practice of planning, which we also think is important to get a sense of if we try to understand power dynamics in this planning practice. And here I should say that we have focused especially, and this is very much the work of my colleague Linnea, especially on a report prepared as part of the orientation planning process in 2015. A report that was really focused on how to reach climate targets for the transport sector. And it was a report that became quite controversial also. So it has been quite interesting to go into that sub-study, but it's also difficult to present it briefly, but I'll try. This was then a sub-project, as I said. It was a work being carried out by a number of experts and experts at the Transport Administration. They based their work on a climate scenario with 80% less fossil fuel use by road traffic in 2030. So even more ambitious than the goal that later was established as the former goal, the 70% goal. This work was conducted with a slightly different approach than the standard conventional approach of Swedish long-term transport planning. They built their work on a backcasting analysis to identify the deficiencies and needs for measures and measures to take to reach the climate targets. And their work led to a number of suggestions of measures for a more transport efficient society with reduced car use, still like not maybe a reduction of transport at large, but a shift between modes to more walking, biking and public transport and so on. And this climate report was eventually excluded then from the orientation plan, so it was not part of the material handed into the government later on. So it was only published at a later stage when the Swedish media had some news about it. And from a power perspective, I think this too explains important things about the power dynamics of national transport planning in Sweden. When we did our interviews, it came out a quite strong sense. I mean, we interviewed persons who were involved in this report, but also other ones who were more like in charge of the transport planning process. And we learned that even though many interviewees saw this work as very interesting and valuable for many reasons, there was also quite strong sense of skepticism regarding exactly how one could really integrate this into the planning process in general, and how to maybe make sense of it in the broader transport planning framework. So for instance, this is an example from an interview with a person who was involved in this process, who said that, well, there were not a great deal of cost calculations, and then also there were not many clear impact relations. Things were not secured. It is also the question of how you will realize it, referring then to like this transport efficient society, and how you will realize it in the most cost efficient way. And I think what we think is important when interpreting this process, I think it's quite understandable in a way when you think of the standard or like established way of doing things within the transport administration, like the regime of practice, which really builds on forecasts, including only decided policy measures, mostly economic policy measures. It is also a regime of practice that builds on expectations of continued increase of traffic and car use. It's a regime of practice that is mainly focused on aggregated quantitative data based upon, what is assumed to be secured causal impact relations, and with a strong focus on economic evaluation based on welfare economics and especially CBA. So I think what we see here is a work that tried to challenge the regime of practice, but the regime of practice couldn't really, pick up this new approach because it didn't fit in, to summarize it very briefly. I will now go to my last slide. So the concluding reflections would be then that what we see here is an ongoing discursive struggle between different understandings of what the climate goals might mean and imply for long-term national transport planning. I think I get the sense that there is really an overall understanding that the transport sector needs to change, but it remains very contested and unclear to what extent it should change. And especially if it is a matter of making things more efficient and, optimizing the existing transport system, or if it is a matter of more fundamental transformation of the things, the way we travel and our expectations of the level of investments in new infrastructure and so on. There is also a strong belief in technological innovation, and I would say also a strong confidence in conventional transport planning. And there's also, I would say, a reproduction of an understanding of long-term infrastructure planning as an activity of marginal relevance for climate targets. I think this is really something one should discuss much more in the Swedish context. I have an understanding of climate as the climate crisis as a crisis that really demands all sectors of society to transform in a more fundamental way. But here, the meaning making and the discursive practice reproduces an understanding, saying that, well, yeah, there's a need for a change, but maybe not as much. So the power dynamics we've identified here, they serve to consolidate a non-transformative perspective. And what I haven't said so much about in my presentation, but one could discuss that much more, is that, of course, this is a planning area full of all sorts of, essentially political questions. And with political, I mean issues, things that, where there are essential value conflicts, a need for, prioritization between real alternatives and so on. But these essentially political matters are not visible in the documents we've studied. And I think that the discursive practice reproduces a quite depoliticized understanding of transport planning. Sorry for speaking a bit too long, but I'm now finished.
Not at all. Thank you, Karolina, for a really enlightening presentation, and I think some really fascinating things that would be great to discuss more in the discussion around the reproduction of framing and how discourse is layered and so pervasive within some of these conversations. If anyone would like to ask a question, you can either raise your hand and I will enable your microphone, or you can either put a question in the Q&A box and I will do my best to read them out as we go. We've already had a question in from Kate Pangborn, who says, very interesting talk, thank you. I'd be interested to know if there is any recognition of life cycle analysis in relation to infrastructure planning, as there are perhaps emissions reductions to be made upstream, for example, in infrastructure building materials and processes, if not in the actual operation of the infrastructure. Though, of course, deciding to build certain infrastructures has big implications in shaping how people travel, and thus there is an indirect impact on carbon emissions. Is that recognised?
Yes, it is recognized. And I could have mentioned that, I think, but that's really recognized, I would say, and has been a matter of increased attention during the last years. So that's recognized. Thank you for the question, Kate.
We have another question from Andrew Nash, who's asking, do you think there is a problem with a political elite not reflecting the actual desires of real people? Yeah, maybe. I think also that question really opens up for like, what do we know of the real desires of people? I'm not sure, but maybe another way to answer is that in the Swedish context, the climate policy framework was a framework that, for instance, included this, the long-term goal of zero emission 2045, and also the 70% until 2030. It was a decision taken in clear consensus. Only one political party, which is the Sweden Democrats, it's our nationalistic party. All the other parties have agreed, but I think maybe also that we really need more engaged dialogue and discussion among the political elite, the experts, citizens living in various places, of what this means, what it could imply in practice, and how to take this further, really. I think there's a lack of that type of discussion in Sweden today. Thank you. So Robin Hickman has a couple of questions. The first one is, do we think the current transport planning process is helpful in reducing transport CO2 emissions? And then just to follow up, if not, how do we deal with inertia in the process? So the regime of practice, that would be what would a better process look like?
Also a very good question. I think that Yeah, to be very clear, I think we have an urgent need for a new type of transport planning that builds more on like that is more clearly framed around. I mean, if we agree that long-term sustainability, the Agenda 2030 goals, including the climate targets, if we agree that they are so important as we have said, I think we need to reframe the transport planning process essentially. I don't think we shall throw everything out, not at all. There are so many qualities, there are so many skilled persons, so many, you know, so much knowledge really around. But I think that the inertia here it's really so difficult to break, because it's in everything. It's in the way we talk, it's in the way we interpret the policy goals, it's in the you know, the details of how we value time savings in the calculations of, like, you know, what infrastructure project to fund and not fund and so on. So I think we need to look through kind of all the parts of it, to be honest. That's if not, I think it's, I mean, since it's such a long-term process also, it has really a strong momentum. So, and it also builds on decisions taken in the previous plan and the plan before that and so on. So it's, yeah, I think we more or less have to scrutinize all parts of it.
Great. Andrew is following up with a couple of questions around that with regards to framing. So I guess first is, you know, how would you reframe the conversation? And second, what about the framing of a transport efficient society? Do you think this option has been framed well?
Yeah, I think actually I'm quite hesitant to reframe it myself. I think this is exactly what we would need to have a more like democratic discussion about. But I could say that if we shall take the climate goals seriously, it needs to be framed more about the idea of transformation, like a fundamental change, and think of how to reach. I mean, the transport sector has an important task to offer accessibility to all, I think, and how to, you know, how to do that within the planetary boundaries and with the respect for social justice and so on. So I think somewhere around that, but I think there's need for many more people than me to reframe it. Sorry, the next question was, it was a follow-up question from the last speaker that I lost it.
We were just about the framing of a transport efficient society.
Oh, that's a very important, interesting question. Actually, that's another research project. It's that is what has turned up as very like a big discussion in Swedish national transport policy and planning, like the last 2-3 years, and really like the essential meaning of transport efficiency, because there we have. The inspiration is, I guess you know about this avoid, shift, improve discussion from UN and international documents, that we need, you know, technological improvements, shift to more sustainable transport modes, but also reduce transport. And the discussion about transport efficiency in the Swedish context is reflecting that discussion. But that's also something where there are many contested, you know, meanings of how to best work for transport efficiency. Exactly what measures that we can trust as, you know, being able to deliver on that. And another research project.
Thank you. I'm going to go to people who haven't yet asked a question, and then I'll come back to those with questions still outstanding. I've got a question here from Jens Highlander. The presentation focused on the relation between the government and the transport administration as the main actors in the process. Are there any other stakeholders who you have recognised as having an influence over long-term planning? And is there any lobbying, be that political or private, being done, for example?
Thank you, Jens. Yeah, I could have said much more about that. I mean, I think that when reading those documents and thinking about this, I often come back to the, you know, I guess you all know Sweden is, or maybe I should say used to be, but is still a car producing society. There is a strong, I mean, there are many industrial interests here, both from the vehicle production industries, also the construction industry, of course. So yeah, there is quite clearly lobbying around, but I haven't explored that. It's just that you could feel that, you can sense that in several ways.
Linking to kind of institutional relationships, Harriet Dunn says, thank you for the presentation. As a theoretically non-political ideological organisation with a separation from the central state government, is there a space for the Transport Ministry to incorporate more radical perspectives on sustainability into their future planning processes? Is it possible to identify any leverage points moving forwards?
Yeah, that's also very interesting. Yeah, maybe like a very general, like an overall reflection is that I think that there could be quite interesting possibilities for exactly that. But we have also a quite difficult political situation in the Swedish context, with like in almost all other countries, I think, in the many other European countries, with a minority government consisting of the Social Democrats, who doesn't have, I mean, they don't have their own majority. They collaborate with the Green Party, but they're also dependent on the support from two like liberal right parties. So if there was a political agreement within the government about what road to take, I think that could open up some interesting opportunities here. But at the moment, there are also quite difficult struggles within the government. That's my interpretation, at least. And maybe that's also an explanation why things are a bit vaguely stated in the instructions. I think also, however, that we have, within this institutional context, we've had a tradition in Sweden of maybe, you know, sometimes public administrations can be more brave than the government, interpreting the will of the government and saying that, well, if that's what you mean, we would need to do this and this, and we would need to have a clearer instruction, for instance. I think that dialogue and those types of interactions could be quite interesting to explore also for the future, like what and how to do that within the scope of the democratic legitimacy still. So I think, yeah, interesting to think further.
Okay, and then I've got a question from Greg, and then I've got one from Manu, and then we'll see how we're getting on for time. So Greg?
Yeah, thanks, Karolina. So picking up on the last point, really, but I just also wanted to reflect on the language of friendly rather than compliant. It feels to me that we exist in a world where it's okay to talk about long-term targets, but it's not actually in line with the science, which is about budgets and what happens this year, next year, and the year after. And so I wonder if there's some kind of framing question about, you know, how that's thought through. But the question Harriet asked, I think, is really important. I was going to ask what's the recursive relationship between the institutional structures and framing. We have a similar issue with our kind of roads agency. It doesn't set tax policy, it doesn't define economic strategy, so it doesn't have any of the levers to really talk about travel demand. So it ends up in a discussion about infrastructure. And I wonder actually whether, you know, well, they were set up at different times for different purposes, but now you've got those boundaries, whether that's actually a cause of the friction in the system or the lack of willingness, and whether it's actually a useful depoliticization strategy in any case for national government now that they're there.
Yeah, this points out something very important, I think, as well. And I think, this was then the last round of this long-term planning process, 2015 to 2018. I think even though things were a bit different then, like in the common understanding of the urgency, it was urgent then as well. It's even more urgent today, or if you can compare, I don't know. It's quite surprising how little focus it is on those, like the idea of planetary boundaries, a climate budget, and so on. Yeah, I don't know how to respond. It opens up many reflections for me. Maybe yeah, sorry, Greg, can you repeat again the question?
Well, that was really a reflection on whether that's one reason why everyone's more comfortable talking about long-term targets, and not actually therefore facing up to what the real scale of change might be. Yeah.
I can also mention that the discussion we have today, like the last year maybe, there's a new kind of discussion in the Swedish transport policy debate, where quite a few voices have started to challenge the 2030 target, saying that we won't reach it anyway, and it could be interpreted in several ways. One positive understanding of it is that it will not be met. So if with the existing kind of policy measures, so we better speed up now and make sure we catch up later. Another interpretation is that also builds a ground for not doing things, or continuing to point at some things to be done later on and so on. So, and I think also that, it is, I think of this as a depoliticization of things that are extremely political. But I also, what I can't figure out really, and maybe you can help me, is that why, you can, of course, it's not politically rewarding to deal with those difficult issues in a way, but also, what I guess that the trust in politics also builds extremely a lot on how our political leaders manage to take on these difficult issues. I think that the COVID situation has been another example, but that led to quite completely different type of discussion in society. Actually, I can't really figure out in a way, but it's a clear example of depoliticization, of pushing targets for later on, and a quite worrying gap between the level of understanding among most researchers and the actual decision makers. And I don't know about the wider population and the citizens. I think probably they are quite worried too. But I think also here we can just feel it's a lack of discussion and debate on how to face this, really.
I've got 3 questions that are in our chat box that I'm just going to read out for you, and then depending on how much time you can reflect back on those, and then it may be that you follow up with the questioners after if we don't get a chance to discuss them fully. So the first one from Manu. Thank you, Karolina. From a life cycle analysis perspective, we often see that maintenance strategies for infrastructure often ignore the environmental impacts of such strategies, for example, fuel emissions as a function of road quality. Is such a discussion happening in Sweden to consider such perspectives within transport infrastructure, asset management? I guess linking back to Kate's question earlier. Andrew asks, or comments, it's funny that the agencies responsible for transport infrastructure don't think that infrastructure is effective. Any comments? And then the final one, thanks for your presentation. Two parts to the question. First, what was the existing power dynamics problem that you were exploring? And what are your biggest findings to the existing norm? I think I might want to follow up if I've not understood that correctly. What have your biggest findings been in relation to those existing norms? And how do you ensure that you have chosen the right type of discourse to address the issue, the right sample of discourse to understand your problem? I guess that's more a research design question.
Yeah. Trying to take notes so I will not forget the questions again. Being a bit embarrassed there. I forgot the last.
They're quite big questions you've been asked, so it's fine.
Well, I guess starting with the life cycle question, I think that is my understanding is that it is included, but not completely. What I've seen so far is that it is included in like the way you discuss infrastructure investments, the importance of having this like life cycle perspective on things, and also being aware that also, I mean, all investments or all things we construct also has a climate impact. For instance, it has been a large discussion about new railways, that they are also leading to negative climate emissions during the construction and so on. But on the other hand, we have also an upcoming debate about electrification, which is now the new, sometimes it sounds as the new like silver bullet for solving the climate crisis. And then there's less focus on life cycle perspectives, like the batteries, the vehicles, and so on. So it's part of it, but only, you know, to some extent. Then about the next question, why infrastructure is not seen as important. I think that's quite funny too, actually, because it's like, you know, making, reducing their own importance in a way. But I think, actually, I think it can be understood in many ways. I think it's trying to be fair. I think it's based upon, I mean, a correct analysis that the transport system consists of so many different parts, basically. So, of course, you can't expect to solve everything with infrastructure, especially not if you think of infrastructure as equal to new infrastructure, because new infrastructure will always have a climate impact. So, but it's also, I think I'm not saying that that was the intention, but it creates a quite odd discussion about making this sector, which, you know, consumes huge amounts of money, into a quite limited, a sector of limited importance. And I mean, from a long-term perspective, of course, the way we construct the transport system is that really, I mean, talking about affecting people's behavior, it affects how we can travel, how we can live, what places are connected and not, and so on. So it's really, but I think also it's a response to many years of critique that they have got due to like other agencies working more with climate and environment have complained and so on. So it's a way also to maybe defend themselves in a way, some interpretations. And just very briefly then, the last question, well, the power dynamics we try to explore here is really the dynamics of meaning making, interpretations, the framing of like the climate goals, what they can mean, what they can mean, what they should mean for transport planning. And the findings, that was, you know, this remaining non-transformative understanding, the belief in technological innovation, not so much about fundamental change and so on. So those were the norms we found. The sample of discourse, it's not that we made a sample. We've been, and sorry that I didn't go into that, but we've been doing this as a close reading of documents. So it's really the results of our findings. But now I only presented a glimpse of maybe, you know, what could have been much more developed, of course. But that's the way we did it. Mm.
Thank you, Karolina. Well, unfortunately, we're on the hour, so that we have to wrap up there. Just to say thank you again for an excellent presentation that's created such a rich conversation. And thank you to all of our participants who provided such great contributions as well. I hope you've all found that interesting. Our next webinar is on the 24th of November, and we'll be providing more information about that on our website and through our social media. So hopefully you can join us again then. But until next time, thank you all. Have a lovely day. Thank you.
Thank you.